Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to talk about something that's very important for us, especially if you're going on to take other courses in this program, and that is creating forms in HTML. So I'm sure you've all visited a web page where you need to enter some information and then submit a form. That's what we're going to cover in today's lesson. Let's get started here by creating a sample file for us. We can go ahead and right-click on the HTML folder here in VS Code, choose New File, and you can name it forms.html. Okay, there we go. And let's put in the starter code. So we'll do the HTML5 shortcut right there. And then I always have my beginning students indent the head and the body element so that we can clearly see that they are children of the HTML element. We'll go ahead and update the title here to make it say forms. And I suppose I should put an H1 element right here, and I'll make that say forms as well. Okay, so to get started here, if you want to put a form on your web page, it starts by adding a form element. So right underneath the H1 right here, type in form and hit enter. And you can see that VS Code added the action attribute. We're going to fill that in just a second, but we do also want to add another attribute right here. And the name of the attribute is method. And then we want to set the value of that method attribute to post, all caps, just like that. Okay, now I'm not going to talk about this. This is something that we get into more later in the program, but you do need to have the method attribute set to a value of post in order for all this to work. Okay, and now let's talk about the action attribute. When you submit a form, it has to send the data to another web page that can process the data that got entered into the form. So the action attribute specifies the URL of the page that's going to receive the data. Now, I've created a page that can do that for us, so you'll have to type this in for the value of the action attribute here. It's going to be https://, and then we're going to type in www.wtc-web.com, and then /form-handler.php. So this is a PHP page that can process the data that we send to it. And if you make a mistake in this, then your form won't submit properly later in the activity here. Okay, let's go ahead and put the opening form tag and the closing form tag on their own lines. Just going to kind of rearrange some things right here. Okay, and now we can start to add inputs inside of this form element right here. So the first thing we'll do is we'll add just a simple text box. But before we do that, we should add labels so that users know what to enter into the text box. Here's what I mean. Let's add a label element right here as the first child of the form element. So type in label and hit enter. We're going to ignore that for attribute right now. Maybe I'll come back and talk about that in just a second. But for now, let's go ahead and put some content inside of this label, and we'll make it say first name. Okay, and you'll see where this label comes into play in just a minute when we load this page in the browser. Now, underneath the label, let's add an input element. So an input element allows users to enter input. So type in input and hit enter, and you can see that VS Code wants us to specify a value for the type attribute. You can just leave it as the default as text. That means that this input is going to be a text box, which you'll see in just a second. Now, I do want to add another attribute to this. It's the name attribute, and I'll show you where this comes into play in a second too. So type in name equals, and then your pair of double quotes right there. And then what we'll do is let's just type this in for the value of the name attribute. First name. Now that's all one word, and notice that I capitalized the N. So we shouldn't really put spaces inside of these values here, So what we do is instead of putting a space is we remove the space and make the first letter of the new word be capital. This is something that we'll talk about more once we get to JavaScript too, but this is called camel casing, and we'll learn more about that later. Okay, let's go ahead and save this. So Control S to save your changes, and then open it up in the browser here. Mine's coming up over here. Let me bring it over to this monitor if I can grab it. There we go. And here's what it looks like so far. Okay, so we needed a label element so that this shows up inside of it. Otherwise, if we have just a text box, then the user doesn't know what they're supposed to enter into it. So most of these inputs that we create are going to go along with a label element so that the user knows what they're supposed to enter. Here you can see that here's our input element. And remember, we said it's type attribute to text, which makes it a text input. And I can type into it, something like that. Okay, now there is no button here to submit the form. So that's what we're going to put here next. So go back over to VS Code here. And let's, here's what we're going to do is put your cursor right after that input element and hit return a few times. So we're going to make sure that this input that we add right here stays at the bottom of our form. So we want that button to be at the bottom of the form. Anyways, type in input and hit enter. And now this, we want it to be what we call a submit button. So set the value of the type attribute to submit. Okay, and let's save that. And then Alt-Tab back over to the browser here and refresh the page. And you can see here's our button, and it defaults to saying submit right here. We'll talk about that in just a second. We can change that. We can make it say whatever we want. But let's go ahead and type something in. So I'm just going to type in my name and then hit submit. And hopefully, if everything works, you'll end up on a page like this. So this is where we set the action attribute of the form element. So this is the page that receives the data. Now, I made this page, and really all it does is just regurgitates the data that got sent. So really what a page like this would normally do would be to collect all the data that was entered in the form and probably put it in a database and save it somewhere. But I just made it regurgitate whatever got sent to it so that we can see it here. So here in this little table I've made here, this shows the data that got sent. So does that look familiar? First name. That is the name attribute that we added to our text box. So when the data gets to the server, it needs to know what the data means. For example, if we didn't send this and all we sent was the value that got entered, the server would not know if this was the first name or the last name or whatever. So the name attribute is very important. You need to add those to your input elements because they serve as labels for when the data gets sent to the page that receives the data. Okay. All right, and here's the value that I typed into the text box. Okay, hit the back button here and go back to our form. And let's do a little bit of formatting right here. Let's go back to VS Code here. And what I want to do is let's put a line break after our label element. So we'll type in BR and hit enter. And then I'm also going to come down here to just before the submit button, our input element with the type of submit. I'm going to add another line break right there. And then not a big deal. And there's better ways to put line breaks in a form, but we'll learn about them later. Save it, go back to the browser, hit refresh, and we want our form to kind of stack vertically like this just to keep it nice and easy to read here. Okay, let's see. I'm going to add a value attribute here to our submit button. So let's add an attribute. The name is value, and we want to set the value of that value attribute to save like that. Okay, so if you want to control the label on the submit button, you can do it by setting the value attribute. If I save it real quick and Alt-Tab back to the browser, and now you can see our submit button says save. Okay, back over in VS Code here, we have this empty line. We're gonna build on this form here. So I'm actually gonna hit return a few times and keep that submit button down below. And then I'm going to go back here. I'm going to add a BR element just to put line breaks in our form here. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a label. And the label is going to say agree to our terms. So type in LABEL and hit enter. And again, we're ignoring that for attribute for the moment. And what we want this to say is agree to our terms. Okay. And I'm sure you've seen this on forms before where you have to check a box that signifies that you agree to the terms of service. And so that's what we're going to do here is we'll add a checkbox. So underneath the label, add an input element, type in input and hit enter. And let's set the type attribute to a value of checkbox here like that. Okay, we should give it a name. We talked about the name attribute, how that gets sent to the page that receives the form data. And let's just make this be agreed. You can set these to whatever you want, we'll just set it to that, meaning that they agreed to the terms of service here. Okay, and let's go ahead and save that. Go back over to the browser, refresh the page, and there you can see there's our label and there's the checkbox. Go ahead and check the box, and if you want you can type in a name, it doesn't really matter though, and then hit save. And here we go. Here are the name attributes. So again, those are important because those serve as labels for the data when they reach the page that processes the data. Now by default, this is going to say on, but we can control what this value is by adding a value attribute. So if we go back to the form here, find the checkbox element, the input with the type set to checkbox, and I can add a value attribute here, and I'll just set it to yes, meaning yes, they agreed. Okay, save the changes, Alt-Tab back to the browser. I need to hit the back button here, and I'll probably need to refresh it too. Just to be safe, let's refresh this page, and then go ahead and check the box and enter a name, and hit submit or hit the save button here. And now, so there you can see that the value that's going to get sent is whatever we made the value attribute for that checkbox. Okay, hit the back button. Let's go back over to VS Code, Alt-Tab back over to VS Code. Okay, so there's how you can add checkboxes to a form. All right, right here, let's add another BR element. Put in a line break here to kind of separate things in our form. And let's add a group of radio buttons. So let's say we're asking the user to choose their favorite pizza. So the first thing I'm going to put here is a label element. Okay, and we're ignoring that for attribute for the moment, so I'm just going to delete it, or you can leave it, it doesn't really matter. But let's make this label say favorite pizza, like that. And then underneath that label, we'll add another BR. I don't really like using all these BR elements. It's not really the way we should be doing this, but it works for now. Okay, and now what we need, we're going to put 3 radio buttons. I'm sure you've seen radio buttons before. You'll recognize them once we put them on the page. Here's how we're going to do this. We're going to put them inside of labels because each radio button needs a label. So go ahead and add another label element. And I'm just going to ignore that for attribute for now. And then split the label opening tag and closing tag apart. And let's put an input element inside of the label here. So type in input, hit enter, set the type to radio, okay, and then set the name attribute to pizza, like that, and let's set the value to sausage. So set the value attribute to sausage like that. Okay, and then underneath the input, but still inside of our label element, we'll make it say sausage. Okay, let's take a look at this and see what it looks like. Save your changes, Alt-Tab back to the browser and hit refresh here, and you can see what's starting to develop here is here's our label that says favorite pizza. Here's our radio button. And now radio buttons don't come with a built-in label. So that's why we had to add the label that says sausage here. Now, there's different ways you could do this. I just decided to make the radio input a child of the label. That's pretty common to do, I think. When you do that, you'll see in a minute that allows you to press on the label and then it will automatically check the button. I'll show you that in just a minute here. Okay, now it doesn't make sense to have a radio button as just one radio button. They're meant to be groups, and a user can choose one radio button from the group. So we need to add a few more radio buttons here. Alt-tab back to VS Code, and what I'm going to do is copy this whole entire label element. So I'm copying all that right there. And then I'm going to put my cursor right below it. And then I'm going to do Control V to paste it. And now we want to tweak a few things right here. Two things actually. We're going to set the value of this radio to be pepperoni. Like that. And then we're going to change the text, the content that's inside the label element to pepperoni. Okay. Like that. Save your changes, Alt-tab back to the browser, hit refresh, and now we'll see how these radio buttons work together. Okay, now the way these work is if you click one, it becomes selected. If you click another one, it deselects whatever was selected before and selects that. So this allows you to offer a few options to your user, and they pick one of them. Let's add one more option to our pizza choices. So go back over to VS Code here. Whoops, where is it? There it is. Okay, let's go ahead and copy the whole entire label element, including its children. We'll copy that there, and we'll paste it right underneath itself. Make sure you keep your indentation nice and neat. And let's set the value of this one to mushroom. Okay, and then we'll change the content that's inside the label element to mushroom. Okay, save it with Control S, Alt-tab back to the browser here, hit refresh, and now you've got 3 radio buttons. And I just want to point out that, and you can only choose one of them, so it will, if you change the selection, it'll deselect what was previously selected. Now, the reason that these are working together as a group like that is because they all have the same value for their name attribute. That's what makes these a group. So it's important that each one of the radio buttons in a group all have the same value for their name attribute. Okay, let's go ahead and submit this form right here. So I'll just type in some garbage for my first name and then hit save here. And there you go. Now this is the value of the selected radio button. So that's why we add a value attribute to a radio button. That's what gets sent to the page that receives the data. Ironically, I didn't check the box. And if you'll notice here, that means nothing got submitted. This is something we'll talk about in a later course when we start working with forms a lot. But if you don't check a checkbox, then nothing gets sent to the receiving page here. Now, let's say for some reason I wanted pepperoni to be selected by default. What I could do then is find that input element, and then I could set its checked value equal to true. Okay, so go ahead and save that, and then Alt-tab back to the browser here. Oops, I need to hit the back button and refresh probably. And now when I reload the page, you can see that the one whose checked attribute is set to true is going to be selected by default. You may or may not want to do that. Okay, let's Alt-tab back to VS Code right here. And the next type of input that we're going to talk about is a select box. And now we don't actually use an input element for this. It has its own element that we're going to use. Let's first put a BR element right here underneath the last label that we added. So I'm going to type in BR and hit enter. And now to create a select box, which you might have heard of them called drop-down lists or combo boxes. But in order to create one of those, on a form here, we use a select element. So type in select and hit enter. Okay, now VS Code wants us to add a name, which we'll do. We're not going to worry about the ID right now. But anyways, we do need to add a name. You know what that's for. That serves as a label for when the data gets to its destination page. This is going to be color. We're going to ask the user what their favorite color is. Now, I did forget to add a label here, so let's do that right now. So let's put that right above the select element. We'll add a label, and then we'll make it say favorite color. Okay, and now a select box really serves the same purpose as a group of radio buttons. It just looks a little bit different, but the whole idea is to offer a choice of options and then let the user choose one. So the radio groups and select elements do the same thing. They just look a little bit different here. Okay, split those select tags apart, and to add options to this drop down or this select box, you add option elements. So type in option, and we're going to ignore this value attribute right there. So you can just delete that or leave it. Actually, you need to delete it. Let's make it say red inside of there. And then let's use the Alt-Shift down arrow trick here. I'm going to add a few more options by doing Alt-Shift down arrow. And then I'm going to change the content that's inside the second one to blue. And then I'm going to change the content inside the third one to green. Okay, save your changes. Alt-Tab back to the browser. Refresh the page. And here you go. I should put another line break in there just to be consistent here. But here is our select element with the option elements inside of it. If you choose one and hit save, you'll see that here's the name attribute. That's very important so that this receiving page knows what green means. It means it goes with color here. All right, I guess I will show you this value attribute right here. I'm going to go ahead and add a value attribute to each one of these. And what I'm going to set it to is the same thing that's inside the content of the option, only I'll just use lowercase here. All right, so that one's going to be blue and lowercase, and then the value of that last option is going to be green lowercase. All right, so there are cases when what you display to the user is a little bit different than what you want sent for the data. If that's the case, you can add a value to each one of these option elements, add a value attribute. Okay, if I save that now, and then I'll Alt-Tab back to the browser here, I have to hit the back button and then refresh the page. So what the user sees is capital letters here. That's what's in the options. But if I choose one and hit the save button, what actually got sent was the value attribute. Okay, now we don't need to worry about that for this class, but this will come into play in a later class. Okay, back in VS Code here. Now, if I wanted to set a default color here, I could add an attribute to this option element. Let's say I want green to be the default favorite color. In this case, we add a selected attribute and set its value equal to true. Okay. Now with our radio buttons, it was the checked attribute, but with select options, it's the selected attribute. That's a little bit confusing. But anyways, if I save my changes here and then Alt-Tab back to the browser, and I need to hit the back button here and refresh the form, you'll see that it defaults to being green. I'm actually going to put a line break right between the label and the select box to stay consistent with what we're doing here. So that's right there. I'll put a BR element just to keep things looking the way we started, and so that puts the label on one line and the select box on another line. Actually, this form is a little bit ugly and hard to read anyways, so but once we get to CSS, we can talk about making the forms look better. Okay, let's go back to VS Code here and sometimes you want to allow the user to enter more than just a line of text. So we added a simple text box. That was the first input that we added. Here, put your cursor right underneath that closing select tag. And here we'll add, well, let me add a BR first, and then a label. And we can just make the label say comments. These could be like comments that you might enter into a form. And then just to kind of keep things consistent, I'll put another BR element there for a line break. And if you want to allow a user to enter more than just a single line of text, you use what's called a text area element. So here, type in text area. We're going to ignore the ID attribute, but you do need that name attribute. Remember, that serves as a label for the data that gets sent to the receiving page. Let's make that set the value of that name attribute to comments, and then that should do it. So if I save my changes and Alt-Tab back to the form and refresh it, you can see that a text area allows you to enter multiple lines. You could even stretch this out if you want, but here you can enter multiple lines, whereas a text box only allows you to enter one line. Alrighty, Alt-Tab back to the browser. This is a long video, but there's a lot of stuff to cover here. One last thing before we're done is we're going to add a date input. So put your cursor underneath the text area, right there like that. I suppose we'll add another BR element, line break, and then we'll add a label here, and this will be for your birth date. So make the label say birth date, and I suppose I'll put another BR right underneath that. And then what we can do here is add an input and set its type equal to date, like that. And then we'll give it a name. We'll set the value of the name attribute to birth date, like that. Pay attention to the capitalization. We'll see a lot more of this in the future. And let's see what this gives us on the form. Save that, Alt-Tab back to the browser, hit refresh, and here you get like a date picker here. So if I click on this, it allows me to choose a date. So that's fairly common on web forms. All right, there you have it. That's everything you need to know about forms for now, at least. And as I said, it's important because later on in the program, a lot of what we do is building forms and then processing the data that gets sent. Usually it goes into a database, and we get into that later on in the program. So you should be all set to do the forms worksheet now.